I start with the organization of the nervous system just to give you sort of a jumping off point for this. This is the objective or question to keep in mind as you go through this particular content. And we're looking at the organization of the nervous system. So when you look at the nervous system can be broken up into two parts. We're looking at the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. When we look at the central nervous system, with the central nervous system, we're talking about the brain, the spinal cord, which are found in the dorsal body cavity. Now, some books say there is no such thing as a dorsal body cavity, there's only the ventral body cavity, but we'll still just mention that some books do say that there is a dorsal body cavity that those are found in. But they said this brain and the spinal cord are very important as the command center for the nervous system and also for a lot of integrative activities. We also then have the peripheral nervous system. The peripheral nervous system is anything outside of the brain and the spinal cord that's related to the nervous system. And it's composed of things like ganglia, which you guys know what ganglia are. Remember, ganglia are those collection of neuronal cell bodies found outside of the brain and the spinal cord. Lots of receptors, but a lot of nerves. So the peripheral nervous system has a lot of nerves, which we know are bundles of axons extending from the central nervous system. These nerves are connections between the body and the central nervous system. And when you talk about nerves, there's different ways to classify them. One way is to talk about how or where they arise from. And when you do that, there's cranial nerves, which are attached to the brain. There's 12 pairs of those, and we're going to spend a lot of time talking about those in this particular unit. And then the spinal nerves. And we have talked about the spinal nerves in the last couple units, the 31 pairs of those which are connected to the spinal cord. When we talk about the peripheral nervous system, there's two subdivisions associated with the peripheral nervous system. There's going to be the sensory, also known as the afferent division, and then there's the motor or efferent division. We talked about the sensory or afferent division first. That sensory or afferent division conveys impulses to the central nervous system. So afferent means to bring something towards something else. And so this is conveying impulses to the central nervous system from sensory receptors. And so when you look at the fibers, which, fibers in the nervous system is the term for the axons. When we talk about nerve fibers in the sensory or afferent division, there are somatic sensory nerve fibers and visceral sensory nerve fibers. Somatic sensory nerve fibers are more that are those associated or coming from things like the skin, skeletal muscles, and joints. When you talk about more of the visceral sensory nerve fibers, those are carrying impulses from visceral organs, so organs within the ventral body cavity. We then have the motor or efferent division. These have motor nerve fibers, so these are conducting impulses away from the central nervous system out to effector organs, and effector organs can be muscles or glands. And when we look at the motor or efferent divisions, there's two divisions to it. There's the somatic nervous system, the SNS, and the autonomic nervous system, the ANS. These are the two divisions of the motor or efferent division. The somatic nervous system, or also sometimes the somatic nervous system is also known as the voluntary nervous system, conducts impulses from the central nervous system out to skeletal muscle. So this is going to be voluntary for the most part. And so this is conducting information out to skeletal muscle fibers so that those cells can contract. The other division is the autonomic nervous system, also sometimes known as the involuntary nervous system. And that involuntary nervous system is going to conduct impulses from the central nervous system out to cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and glands. So cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and glands. And we'll talk a lot more about the autonomic nervous system when it comes to the next unit. Although the lesson on the autonomic nervous system in your textbook is included in this unit, we'll actually only mention it a little bit. Anything we do mention about the autonomic nervous system in these lectures and in lab is fair game, but we'll spend a lot of time talking about the autonomic nervous system in the next particular unit. But with the autonomic nervous system, again, we're going out to effector organs, which are cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and glands. And this autonomic nervous system can be divided into two parts, the sympathetic division and the parasympathetic division. Bless you. The sympathetic division is going to be your fight or flight division, so it's going to mobilize the body in extreme or emergency circumstances. And so it does things like increases heart rate, increases respiration, things along those lines. While the parasympathetic division is going to be that division which is going to control or come into play in your daily activities, so housekeeping activities. That's your rest and digestion system they talk about. So it's going to slow down the heart rate. It's going to cause the stomach and the small intestine to release digestive juices and so forth. And both of these divisions, the interesting part is both of these divisions are targeting the same cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and glands. It's just one division is going to tune it up, turn it on, while the other division turns it down. And so you get this really fine control then of the cardiac muscle, the smooth muscle, and the glands. So this is a very, very sort of generic, brief overview of what we just talked about. We have our central nervous system, which is our brain or spinal cord. Anything outside of that related to the nervous system is going to be part of the peripheral nervous system. We have information coming in as part of the afferent division, which can come from somatic axons and can also come from visceral axons as well. So it's come from organs from within the ventral body cavity. We then have information going out. That information going out then is part of the efferent division. That efferent division can be going to skeletal muscle. If it does, then it's part of the somatic nervous system. If it's going to cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, or glands, it's part of the autonomic nervous system. And that cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, or glands are going to get dual innervation. And so both the sympathetic and parasympathetic, it's just one is going to turn it on while the other one is going to turn it off. So one speeds it up, one slows it down. So we get very fine control of it. I added this in just so that sort of a nice little glossary of certain terms that we'll be using as we go through this particular content. You see the central nervous system, peripheral nervous system, autonomic nervous system. Hopefully you remember things like nucleus, center tracts, things, columns, pathways, ganglion nerves, those kinds of things. We'll be talking a lot about white matter, gray matter, and so forth. And so we added this information in so you have a nice little glossary of terms that you can utilize. Anybody have any questions? And this one as well. That's just a little introduction to sort of where we're going. And in this particular unit, we'll spend a lot of time talking about that central nervous system, as well as a little bit of the peripheral nervous system, because we're going to be talking about the cranial nerves. So the first thing we want to talk about is the skull, and you will be spending a lot of time talking about bone, and specifically the skull in this particular unit. If to learn a lot of the foramina and fissures and so forth, bones associated with the skull, the best thing is to have one in front of you. You always have the opportunity in the laboratory to have these in front of you to work with, but they're also on reserve over in Prior Health Sciences Library. So if you get one out of there, you can have it for 2 hours and work with it. So really the best way to learn this particular structure. These are different objectives and questions to keep in mind as you go through the content. And when we talk about the skull, the bones of the skull are part of the axial skeleton. So we had kind of not talked about this portion of the axial skeleton yet. We're going to now. The skull is composed of 22 bones. 8 are going to form what is known as the cranium or the brain case. That brain case surrounds and protects the brain. The other 14 are going to be associated with the face. And the bones of the face form the anterior aspect of the skull and are responsible for the protection and support of such things as the eyes, as well as the entry into the respiratory and digestive tracts. Most of the bones of the skull are flat bones. So if you remember the different classification of bones, you have flat bones, which have compact bone on both sides and spongy bone in the middle. All bones of the skull articulate via sutures. And remember that when we talk about sutures, we'll mention those in the first, the suture, well, we might as well go talk about it now. Sutures are considered what based on structure and what type of joints based on function. So let's start first with sutures are considered what types of joints based on structure. Everybody remember? So fibrous, cartilaginous, or synovial? Fibers. So fibrous joints. based on structure, and what based on function? Synarthrotic, so they're immovable. So again, sutures are considered fibrous joints based on structure, and based on function, they're gonna be synarthrotic because they're immovable joints. So most of the bones are going to be articulating with one another via those sutures. However, there is one very movable joint, and that's going to be the mandible's articulation to the temporal bone, what's known as the temporal mandibular joint. That's going to be a modified hinge joint. It's a synovial joint, and it's going to be, as we know, synovial joints are all diaphragmatic joints, and so it's going to be allowing for elevation, so closing the mouth, depression, opening the mouth, protraction, sticking it out, and retraction, pulling it back, and slight lateral movement back and forth, which is important for grinding of food. The mandible is the only movable bone of the skull. There's also, besides these 22 bones, there's also an additional 7 bones associated with the skull, the 6 auditory ossicles, so 3 on each side, and then the hyoid bone.
Are sutures found only in the skull, or are they found elsewhere?
Trying to think if there's any during embryonic development. No, sutures are primarily only found associated with the skull. No. And then when it comes down to the skull, what you're going to learn is there's a lot of different fissures, foramina, openings, and there's about 85 named openings. And most are, the important ones are really important because they're allowing the passage of such things as the spinal cord, major vessels associated with the brain, and the 12 pairs of cranial nerves, which transmit information to and from the spinal cord. So as we look at this particular image, this is breaking down the skull, so you can see that we have 8 bones associated with the cranium, 12 bones associated, or 14 bones associated with the face. So 8 for the cranium, you can see those 8 here. 14 for the face, you can see those here. You can see most of the bones of the cranium are actually singular bones, while those for the face are actually mostly paired bones. There's also the 7 associated bones, the 6 auditory ossicles, and the 1 hyoid bone. Here you can see the bones of the cranium and the bones of the face isolated from one another. And we're going to first start with the bones of the cranium. So when you look at the bones of the cranium, there's 8 bones that form the cranium or brain case. We're going to see there's 1 frontal bone, 2 parietal bones, 1 occipital bone, 2 temporal bones, 1 sphenoid bone, and 1 ethmoid bone. And so you're going to have the paired parietal bones, paired temporal bones, but unpaired frontal, occipital, sphenoid, and ethmoid. These bones are going to surround and protect the brain, and these bones also provide attachments for sites for the head and neck muscles. The cranium can be divided into the calvaria and the cranial base. The calvaria literally translates as the bald part of the skull. The 4 bones marked with the asterisk, so the frontal bone, the 2 parietal bones, and the occipital bone create the calvaria, known as the cranial vault or skull cap, which is going to form the superior, lateral, and posterior aspects of the skull. The cranial base, also known as the floor, forms the skull's inferior aspect. As we mentioned, bones of the skull are going to be connected to one another for the most part via these sutures, and there's some major sutures that you are responsible for. Remember, sutures are fibrous joints based on structure and synarthrotic joints based on function. These are the major sutures you are responsible for. You have the coronal suture, which is between the frontal and the parietal bones, the squamosal or squamous suture between the parietal and temporal bones, and you have 2 squamosal sutures, 1 on each side of the skull. The sagittal suture, which is along the mid-sagittal line between the 2 parietal bones, and the lambdoid or lambdoidal suture, which is found posteriorly between the parietal bones and the occipital bone. So the next couple slides just take you through and allow you to find the different bones associated with the cranium and also find the different sutures that we've been talking about. So from this frontal view, a lot of the bones that we're seeing are actually bones of the face, but we start seeing bones of the cranium as well. We can see, for example, the frontal bone in this particular image here. You can also start picking up some of the sutures. So So some of the suture is going to be here, for example, the coronal suture on the coronal plane, and you can see the beginning here of the sagittal suture as well, which will be along the mid-sagittal line. From this lateral view, you can see the coronal suture here between the frontal bone and one of the parietal bones. You can see also one of the squamosal sutures here. You can also see a portion of the lambdoid suture here. Bones that you're seeing, things like frontal bone, parietal bone, occipital bone, and temporal bone. Posterior view of the skull. From this posterior view, you can see the two parietal bones and the occipital bone. You get a very good view of the lambdoid or lambdoidal suture, and also the posterior portion of the sagittal suture. Superior view here. From the superior view, you can see a number of the different sutures we've been talking about. Here's the frontal bone, the two parietal bones, and the beginning of the occipital bone. Here's the coronal suture between the frontal bone and two parietal bones, the sagittal suture between the two parietal bones, and the lambdoid suture between the two parietal bones and the occipital bone. This is showing you an inferior view. From this inferior view, you can see that the number of the bones that are making up sort of the base of the skull, and you can see things like the occipital bone in this position here. You can see the occipital bone here. You're also going to see the temporal bones in this position here, and the sphenoid bone here. This is with the skull cap lifted off, looking down into the skull now. You can see where the section was made from this particular image up here. And so with that removed, you can see into the skull where the brain would be sitting, and you can see a lot of the bones continue into the actual, into more the interior of the skull and help to make up the base of where the brain is going to be sitting. As you can see, the frontal bone is going to be in this position here, sphenoid would be in this position here, temporal bones in this position here, and occipital bone back in this position. And this is a mid-sagittal section, so you can look inside, so you can see how it's sort of a stair-step pattern as you come down. And this is the way that the brain is going to be shaped. And it's going to be able to sit in here very nicely. So we're going to go through each individual bone, talking about the different features associated with each one. You should be very familiar with each of the bones and their particular components. Some have more components than other. We're going to start with the frontal bone. The frontal bone, there is only one frontal bone, and the frontal bone extends into the orbit and forms its roof. So this is an image of the orbit. This is looking at the right orbit here. There's actually 7 bones that are going to compose the orbit. There's 7 bones that compose the orbit. The roof of the orbit, so the first bone that we're going to talk about is the frontal bone. That frontal bone is going to continue up superiorly. You can see it creates what's known as a superciliary arch in this position here, as well as over here. This would be the area where your eyebrows would be located. So you can feel where that superciliary arch or the supraorbital margin will be located. Our superciliary arch, the thickened ridge that supports the eyebrows. As you come up around the margin, so this is the margin right here between the orbit and the beginning of what's known as the forehead, you can see that there's an opening. And sometimes it's just a notch, and sometimes it's a full foramen. So this is a foramen because it's completely surrounded with bone, supraorbital foramen. Or if it's just a notch, it's the supraorbital notch, so one of those two. This is important because there's sensory branches that are going to be coming out of here, specifically the supraorbital nerve. The supraorbital nerve is a branch of the ophthalmic division, or the first division of the trigeminal nerve, which is cranial nerve number 5. So when you look at cranial nerve number 5, cranial nerve number 5 is our very large cranial nerve pair, and it has 3 divisions associated with it. the ophthalmic division, the maxillary division, and the mandibular division. The first division is the ophthalmic division, and that ophthalmic division is going to give off a branch, and that branch is known as the supraorbital nerve. That supraorbital nerve comes out that supraorbital notch or foramen. It's going to then extend and give you sensation to the forehead. It also is going to allow for passageways of arteries and other vessels to also supply areas of the forehead and eyebrows.
Could you say it one more time? The supraorbital nerve is a branch of, did you say trigeminal?
Yeah, so the trigeminal has 3 branches though. So when you look at it, it's really, when you talk about that supraorbital nerve, the supraorbital nerve is a branch of the ophthalmic division of the trigeminal.
Mm. And cranial nerve number 5 runs through there?
So it's a branch of cranial nerve number 5. So this is just giving you different views of the frontal bone in isolation. So here we're actually looking from an inferior view, looking superiorly, and this is actually the roof of the orbit. So you can see where it's creating the roof of the orbits. You can also see then from the sagittal view, a section into the bone, and you can see that there's this air-filled pocket within the frontal bone, and these are the frontal sinuses. And the frontal sinuses are part of the paranasal sinuses. The paranasal sinuses include the air-filled spaces within the frontal bone, the sphenoid bone, the ethmoid, and the maxillae. There's 2 maxillae, so that's why it's called maxillae. Maxilla would be singular. So the paranasal sinuses contain are the air-filled spaces within the frontal, sphenoid, ethmoid, and maxillae. These are air-filled chambers that act as extensions of and open into the nasal cavity. So the paranasal sinuses open up into the nasal cavity. These paranasal sinuses are important for a number of reasons. One is they actually lighten the skull bones. So if you think about it, you would have a lot more weight on the anterior portion of your face if this was all filled in with bone. So it lightens up the skull bones. It's also lined with a mucous membrane, so it's producing mucus. It also helps in resonating during sound production. So within the frontal bone, there's the frontal sinus, which is part of the paranasal sinuses. They vary in size from person to person and also in time of appearance, although usually they develop by the age of 6. But sometimes some people never actually develop frontal sinuses. But a lot of times, if you remember going to the doctor and the doctor pressing on your forehead, they're trying to see if you have any pain associated with the sinuses. See if you have a sinus infection. Mm-hmm.
So on this diagram, in the top picture where it says frontal air cells, is that what you're talking about?
These are actually ethmoid. So this is going to be part of the ethmoid, and then sphenoid is going to be in this area as well.
Okay.
So actually, the frontal sinuses will be up in this area here.
Okay.
Yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Is it not a pathology if someone doesn't develop frontal sinuses?
There is not. I have to look it up, but I don't think there's any clinical significance to it other than that forehead will weight. It'll have a little bit more weight associated with it. And this is actually an image looking into the skull. So what they've done is looked into the skull here and actually isolated the frontal bone. You can see it here in isolation. And so this frontal bone ends up being important because remember there was that stair-step pattern I showed you that was associated with that sagittal view. The first part of the brain is actually going to sit right in this area. This is known as the anterior cranial fossa. And the frontal bone is going to make up most of that anterior cranial fossa. And that anterior cranial fossa is going to support the most anterior portion of the brain. We'll talk more about that when we talk about brain. I also like this particular image because this really kind of hits home the fact that when we look at this bone, this is a flat bone. And so you have compact bone on each side and spongy bone in the middle. And that spongy bone that's in the middle is often called dipole, D-I-P, D-I-P-L-O-E. And it's that spongy bone that's in between.
Can you spell it one more time?
D-I-P-L-O-E. Next to the two parietal bones, they're not real exciting. The parietal bones contribute to the superior and lateral surface of the cranium, form the major portion of the calvaria, but there's not a lot of structures associated with them. You can see that there are temporal lines. There's a superior temporal line and an inferior temporal line. These are going to be important for the attachment of the temporalis muscle, a large muscle that closes the mouth. But other than the superior and the inferior temporal lines, there's not a lot of structures that we need to know associated with the parietal bone. Next is the occipital bone. You have only one of these occipital bones. It contributes to the posterior, lateral, and inferior surfaces of the cranium. You can see here's the bone as it sits in the skull, and here it is in isolation. The cartoon representation on one side and the actual bone on the other. You can see there's a very large hole in it, which is the way it actually translates, the foramen magnum, large hole. And the foramen magnum is going to connect the cranial cavity with the spinal cavity. It allows the spinal cord to hook up with the medulla oblongata of the brain. Also coming through the foramen magnum are going to be the two vertebral arteries. Two vertebral arteries which create the posterior circulation for the brain. We also have coming through here very small spinal arteries. Some other structures are the occipital condyles, here, 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 and here. And you know, anytime you see the word condyle, there's an articulation going on there. These are found on either side of the foramen magnum. It's where the skull articulates with the first cervical vertebrae. And that first cervical vertebrae is known as the atlas. The atlas. So this is known as the atlanto-occipital joint. The atlanto-occipital joint. It's a synovial joint. It's condyloid. Because it's synovial, it's freely movable, so it's diaphragmatic. It allows for flexion, extension, lateral flexion, and circumduction of the head. So a lot of times we'll talk about the atlanto-occipital joint and realizing that it's the one that allows for the yes movement of the head. Along the midline is the structure that we talked about when we talked about one of the muscles of the back, and that's going to be the external occipital protuberance. Right here, you feel that very large bump along the midline. That varies in sizes from person to person. There's the superior and inferior nuchal lines that come away from that. Superior nuchal line, inferior nuchal lines. These are also for attachment of muscles. And at the base of each of the occipital condyles, so if you go to the occipital condyles, go a little bit into the foramen magnum and turn, there's a canal, an opening into a canal. So this canal is really running superiorly over the condyle, and these are the hypoglossal canals. The hypoglossal canals are going to allow for the passage of cranial nerve pair 12. So cranial nerve 12, the hypoglossal nerves go through here, one on each side. And they control the muscles of the tongue. Those nerves control the muscles of the tongue.
What allows for the no movement of your head?
The no movement of your head is actually gonna be between cervical vertebrae 1 and 2. So that no movement actually occurs a little bit lower.
What is that joint name?
That's going to be the atlanto axial joint.
Okay, thank you.
So now we're looking at the occipital bone inside of the skull. So if you start heading towards the foramen magnum, and right here are going to be the openings to the hypoglossal canals, and those hypoglossal canals continue this direction, allow for the passage of cranial nerve pair 12, and really what they're passing over are going to be the condyles, which are found on the opposite side. The occipital bone makes up the majority of this posterior cranial fossa. This is the posterior cranial fossa. And that posterior cranial fossa is going to house the cerebellum and a little bit of the brainstem. So the occipital bone is really creating this posterior cranial fossa, which is going to house the cerebellum and part of the brainstem. Also, if you go up a little bit anteriorly, right in this area here, this is called the jugular foramen. The occipital bone helps to form a portion of the wall of the jugular foramen. The jugular foramen is named because forming in there is going to be the internal jugular vein, which is going to pass through it. So going through the jugular foramen will be the internal jugular vein, but also being transmitted through the jugular foramen are a number of cranial nerves, specifically cranial nerves 9, 10, and 11. So going through this jugular foramen will be the internal jugular vein and cranial nerves 9, 10, and 11. Temporal bone. There's actually two of these, one on the right, one on the left, and they contribute to the lateral and the inferior walls of the cranium. You can see it in orange. We're going to see that the temporal bone is important because it helps us to form the temporomandibular joint. Specifically, the mandibular fossa, which you see right here. The mandibular fossa of the temporal bone is going to articulate with the condyle of the mandible. As we talked about, that's the synovial joint. It's a modified hinge joint. It's diarthrotic and allows for the motions that we talked about. So that's the mandibular fossa. If you go just behind it, just posterior to it, there's something called the external acoustic meatus. The external acoustic meatus. Meatus means a tube-like opening. At the end of the external acoustic meatus, go in here, you'd find the tympanic membrane, so the eardrum. If you continue posteriorly and go inferiorly, there's something called the mastoid process. The mastoid process is very important for attachments of muscles that are going to rotate or extend the head. So you may have heard of the sternocleidomastoid muscle. It's called the sternocleidomastoid because it's actually attaching to the mastoid process. Head a little bit medially and anteriorly, there's something called the styloid process. Very thin extension of bone, typically the first thing that cracks off of the skull when we get it. The styloid process is important because ligaments that support the hyoid bone attach here, as well as muscles of the pharynx tongue, and larynx. So you got ligaments here that are gonna hold the hyoid bone in place. And you also have muscles of the pharynx, tongue, and larynx attaching here. That small little piece of bone, a lot of stuff attaches there. If you go back to that mandibular fossa and head out anteriorly, you see the zygomatic process. And that zygomatic process is going to be important because it meets up with the temporal process of the zygomatic bone to create the zygomatic arch. And we'll take a look at that in a second. Do that now. So here's your temporal bone. We're looking at this anterior extension of the bone here. This is going to be the zygomatic process of the temporal bone. The zygomatic process of the temporal bone meets up with the temporal process of the zygomatic bone. And the zygomatic bone is one of the bones of the face. So really the process is being named after the bone it's going to articulate with. So zygomatic process of the temporal bone meets up with the temporal process of the zygomatic bone. That creates the zygomatic arch. And that zygomatic arch then creates some spaces. The area superior and deep to the zygomatic arch, so right in this area here, is known as the temporal fossa. And the area inferior to the zygomatic arch and deep is known as the infratemporal fossa. There's lots of stuff that passes through these different areas. So this is an inferior view looking at the temporal bone. So you can see where they've taken it out from. Hold it down here. This is going to be anterior. This is going to be posterior. And so your external acoustic meatus is going to be right in this area, mandibular fossa. Then you're going to have your zygomatic process of your temporal bone. You go backwards and inferiorly, that would be your mastoid process. Then you're going to have your styloid process in this area here. In between your mastoid process and the styloid process, there's a small opening. And small opening is called a stylomastoid foramen because it's between the styloid process and the mastoid process. The stylomastoid foramen is important because the majority of the facial nerve, cranial nerve number 7, is going to come through here to get to the muscles of facial expression. So it's going to come out there, go into 5 branches, and innervate the muscles of facial expression. And that's the majority of cranial nerve number 7. Also on here, you can see the opening called the carotid to the what's known as the carotid canal. The carotid canal is running through the bone. At the end of it is something called the foramen lacerum. So it's an opening. What is happening is that the internal carotid arteries, which serve the anterior aspect of the brain, the internal carotid arteries have to get into the skull. They come up, they get into the carotid canal, they turn 90 degrees, run through that carotid canal, get to the foramen lacerum, turn and use the foramen lacerum to enter into the skull. The interesting portion of part of the foramen lacerum is that if you think about an opening and divide it in half, say we divide it in half, the upper portion of the foramen lacerum is open, and so that internal carotid artery goes through the carotid canal, gets to the foramen lacerum, and can go up into the skull. The bottom portion of the foramen lacerum during our lifetime is actually blocked with some cartilage. So there's hyaline cartilage actually blocking the bottom portion of it. But when you look at the foramen lacerum now in the skull, that cartilage is gone, and so it looks like the foramen lacerum goes the whole way through the skull. this is internal view looking at the temporal bone. The temporal bone has a very flat portion, so here's a shocker, here's that word squamous, it's back again. So it's the squamous portion of the temporal bone, very flat portion of it. There is also then a very hard portion called the petrous portion of the temporal bone. The petrous portion of the temporal bone, bless you, is going to house both the inner ear and the middle ear. So the inner ear and the middle ear are actually this hard part of bone, this petrous portion of the temporal bone. So it makes sense that on the back of the temporal bone is the internal acoustic meatus. And if you follow that internal acoustic meatus, you'll get into the inner ear. Traveling through the internal acoustic meatus is cranial nerves 7 and 8. 7 is the facial, 8 is the vestibulocochlear. Vestibulo for equilibrium and cochlear for hearing. But that's a little interesting because I already said that 7 is going through the stylomastoid foramen, the facial is going through there. The 7 has an interesting path. 7 actually starts by going into the internal acoustic meatus with cranial nerve number 8, and it's going to travel through something called the facial canal so it can get here to the stylomastoid foramen. So 7, cranial nerve number 7, the facial nerve, is associated with both the stylomastoid foramen as well as the internal acoustic meatus.
You said it reaches a facial what?
It's called a facial canal. So see this internal portion actually sitting within the cranial base. So here's our temporal bones, here and here. Here's the petrous portion of the temporal bone. Here's the petrous portion of the temporal bone. So we actually see that the temporal bones, along with the sphenoid bones, help to make this middle cranial fossa. And this middle cranial fossa is where we're going to see sitting the temporal lobes of the cerebrum. But to get from the middle cranial fossa to the posterior cranial fossa, you have to go over the petrous portion of the temporal bone. And there is your internal acoustic meatus, and there's your jugular foramen. Other things you can see, there's the foramen lacerum, so that's where the internal carotid artery is going to come up on both sides. That's the end of the carotid canal. And here you can see the anterior cranial fossa, middle cranial fossa, the posterior cranial fossa. And when we look at the brain, we'll see how that fits in there very nicely. Why don't we go ahead and take a 5-minute break? So we'll come back at 37.